Hopefully you watched episode 0 of this series. That's the one that gives all of the background for every future episode. As for those future episodes, they will all go over one aspect of the Pokemon formula and potential fixes for it, if I have any. In addition, I've played some Scarlet and Violet since writing that video, so now I can talk about its changes to the formula. With that out of the way, let's get started. When it comes to HMs and field moves, there were multiple implementations over the 9 generations. For the purposes of this video and future ones, I will use the broader term field moves, since it allows me to encompass the bike and other non-HM moves that Pokemon can use outside of battle, such as teleport and dig. HM specifically were primarily used to gate progression, but they also allowed players to interact with Pokemon in more ways than just battling. With that terminology clarified, let's take a look at the first style of field moves, the ones found in generations 1 through 6. For the first 6 generations of games and the Let's Go games, field moves all worked almost the same, until Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, with the Eon Flute also acting as HM Fly, but I'm not going to be talking about that now. HM specifically were only given to the player as they progressed through the story, and were used to cross or destroy obstacles that blocked their way through an area. All other field moves were nice to haves like Dig, Teleport, and the Bike. The Bike allowed one to travel faster, and the other two were used to instantly travel out of a cave or to the most recently used Pokemon Center. As generations went on, more and more HMs were introduced, such as Waterfall and Dive. The most notable field moves were, in order, Cut, Fly, Surf, Strength, Flash, Whirlpool, Waterfall, Rock Smash, Dive, Defog, and Rock Climb. So what were the benefits of this system? Well, first off, it gave your party members a use outside of battle. I think this is the biggest benefit. In a universe where Pokemon exist and people's lives are so intertwined with them, I imagine they serve uses in all aspects of society. People would be using them for transportation, construction, healthcare, sports, cooking, competitions, entertainment, industry, basically everything. This is what I liked most about the old field move system in the older games. Pokemon served a purpose outside of battle. I mean, battling is fine, good even. I just find it hard to imagine a world with these fantastic creatures where the only purpose they serve is to fight each other. It's also what I like about the anime and the Detective Pikachu movie. They showed Pokemon doing tasks other than battling in ways that make sense. In the video games, you'd be hard-pressed to find a Machamp that acts as a crossing guard or a group of Pikachu providing power to a Pokemon Center. That's what this old system got right about Pokemon. What other benefits came out of the system? Mechanically, besides gating progression, they also promoted exploration. Since you might not always have every HM taught to your team members, the developers were fine putting little side sections that were blocked off by HM obstacles. Oftentimes they would just have a small offshoot that contained a TM or a special item, but in some rare cases, there were entire side sections containing trainers, wild grass patches, and many items. Finding these small hidden areas was fun, especially if you had to come back to it. And that's a good thing. Something that makes rewards, well, rewarding was the amount of effort put in. It's a fine line to balance, but remembering to come back to an area with a Pokemon that knows the right field move to get a secret item is enough effort to have obtaining that secret item be worth it. One last major benefit of the old system is that it enabled more puzzles to be in the game. Strength was notorious for this, but Dive and Waterfall also enabled this, such as in Hoenn, where finding the exact right spot to dive in to find secret caves was also a puzzle itself. There was also the water flows in some surfing spots that forced your movement, so you'd have to figure out which path to go on to make it to the end. Puzzles were great. Puzzles are great. Finding a way to have my Pokemon help me solve a puzzle is even better. Now for the cons of the old HM system. To start off, the biggest one is that it restricted team composition. Some people like this because it forces them to think a little more about what Pokemon they should have in their party, but many end up just finding a Pokemon that can learn a wide variety of HMs and only using that one for field moves, the notorious HM slave. Even for those that didn't do that, it caused many Pokemon in their team to have to waste a move slot to learn these HMs that were often really bad for battling. In addition, HMs were not easily replaced by another move. You had to go to a move deleter, which was an NPC found in a later area of the game, and they would force your Pokemon to forget the HM. The primary reason for doing so was to avoid soft locks, but while that ended up mostly being successful with its goals, it also made it harder for players to use the moves they wanted to on their team members. Next, the field move animations were sufficient. They weren't flashy or cool. Oftentimes a small cutscene would play, the Pokemon sprite would appear on screen, and the HM would just happen. You'd understand that it was your Pokemon doing the work, but you wouldn't see it happening, short of HM Fly. This was mostly due to the limitations of the systems the older games were on, however. It wasn't until Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire that we got something not amorphous to surf on, but only if you used Sharpedo to surf. Other than that, it was just a regular old, unclear blob. Lastly, sometimes what HM you could teach to which Pokemon didn't make sense. For example, Pidgey can learn Fly. In battle, this makes sense. Pidgey should be able to fly high in the air and swoop down on their opponents, dealing damage. Outside of battle, however, Fly is used to transport players from town to town. Pidgey. You're telling me that a 1 foot, or 0.3 meters, bird that weighs 4 pounds, or 1.8 kilograms, can pick up an entire 10-year-old and transport him or her across an entire country? Yeah, right. Jigglypuff can learn Strength. Nidoqueen and Nidoking can learn Surf, despite being weak to water. Swirlix, which is made of cotton candy, which dissolves in water, can learn Surf. How the hell does Binacle swim well enough to transport a human across vast expanses of ocean? I don't know, maybe it floats and the player holds on to it and it rotates like a propeller? Sometimes HMs didn't make sense for the Pokemon you could teach it to. Now, on to the next implementation of field moves. Starting with a bit of Generation 6 and fully in Generation 7 onwards was the use of mounts for field moves. In these games you were given a new Pokemon to ride periodically, and each new mount could do something different that was equivalent to older field moves like Rock Smash, Strength, and Surf. There were, of course, a few exceptions, but the most major were Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet's implementations. Sword and Shield really only had 3 field moves: the Bike, Corviknight Ride, and an upgraded form of the bike that could go on water. Scarlet and Violet had the box Legendary be the only mount, but by going down the path of legends you could increase their abilities, such as enabling them to go on water, dash, or glide. The switch to this system was probably made as a quality of life feature. This directly solved one of the biggest problems with the old system, that being that it restricted team composition. Not having to dedicate one team member to learning all the HMs allowed people to finally travel with their desired party. Even with individual Pokemon, you no longer needed to waste move slots on HMs. Finally, my water starter didn't end the game knowing Surf, and the flying type on my team didn't beat the champion knowing Fly. I could have them know other attacks. It was beautiful. Another problem that the newer system fixed, at least in the games that weren't Sword and Shield, was the lackluster animations. Now that the Surf Pokemon was only ever going to be a select few Pokemon, Game Freak could program in surfing models that actually looked like the Pokemon that was providing the transport. The same goes along for the Fly and Glide field moves. My favorite of the bunch is actually Generation 7's version of Strength, where a Machamp carries you with 2 of its arms and uses the other 2 to push boulders. After years of seeing the trainer doing pushing, but the game telling me that it's actually the Pokemon doing it, it feels good to have an actual Pokemon moving the boulders. One bonus that it also brings is that it enables a smoother transition between not riding a Pokemon and riding one, and also between mounts. For all the crap I give Sword and Shield about its surfing mechanic, it does feel good being able to go straight from land to water without sitting through a cutscene. And Scarlet and Violet do this even better, being able to smoothly transition between all modes of transport simply because they're all tied to the same Pokemon. This smoothness is even better because open world games benefit from being able to control the pace at which you travel. As you can imagine, the last benefit is another one that fixes another problem with the old system: the nonsensical logic behind which Pokemon can learn what HMs. Because the new system only allows for very specific Pokemon to perform the field move, Game Freak can choose Pokemon that obviously make sense when doing the actions. For the most part, no one's questioning if a giant dog can sniff out items in the ground, or if Weirdeer can run quickly with a person on its back. It just works. However, not all is good. With this change came the loss of one of the biggest bonuses of the old system: having your own Pokemon be the one that you ride. Even in Scarlet and Violet, Koraidon and Miraidon are only mounts until late into the game. You can't use them in battle. You can only ride them, despite them belonging to you. Actually, not really, but yeah, they're technically yours. Granted, these games did a lot to try to increase the player's bond with their mounts, but I still would have liked to occasionally ride other Pokemon that I own. You know, give me a ride on a break every now and then. With Sun, Moon, Sword, Shield, Brilliant Diamond, Shining Pearl, and Legends Arceus, I never really formed a bond with any of the Pokemon I used as mounts. The older system enables field moves to strengthen our bonds with our party members even more than if they were only used for battle. Another drawback is that routes started becoming less interesting, because always having access to field moves meant that they weren't ever going to be used to block off small side paths, only progression. You can't design routes with small offshoots blocked by small trees or breakable rocks because there is no mystery. Always having access to cut and rock smash makes these obstacles effectively useless. And why have obstacles in a game that are basically non-existent when you can just have them not exist? That's my biggest gripe with Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl's implementation. They took the same Sinnoh route designs and assumed it would still work well if the player has access to HMs at all times. It would have been better if they only kept the obstacles that blocked progression, moved all items hidden by non-progression blocking obstacles out of the little hidden offshoots, removed those obstacles, and covered up the remaining holes in the collision. Sure, you'd get more boring route layouts like in Sun and Moon or Sword and Shield, but at least you wouldn't have something boring and useless in the game. So, what can we do? For this next section, just a little heads up, I will be showing gameplay from games other than the Pokemon ones, simply because, you know, I'm trying to provide a solution to a problem that is in the Pokemon games, meaning that I would have to talk about something that's not already in the games. Just a heads up. It seems like Game Freak is dead set on continuing the current implementation of field moves, and honestly, if it keeps on being like Scarlet and Violet's implementation, it will be alright. It will still suffer from being limited to one or a few Pokemon, but in other aspects it will only ever just be fine. However, if the devs want to try something new, I have an idea. My solution is basically a license system. Here's how it works. Throughout your journey in a region, you will come across the typical environmental obstacles and won't be able to traverse them, much like in every other mainline Pokemon game. My solution combines the two approaches. Sort of. The biggest problem with the initial implementation was that it restricted team composition too much. However, with this new system, at certain points in the story, you would be able to teach your Pokemon a field move, but it wouldn't be an attack that they learn. Let's take Surf as an example. In this hypothetical Pokemon game, you would come across a port town or one on the beach or whatever, some town themed around water, and somewhere in town is a building with a huge pool. This is the training center. The employees there are able to test and certify your Pokemon for the use of the aquatic transport field move. You'd go up to the person there and talk to them. You'd select a Pokemon that you'd want to train or certify in aquatic transport, and you'd play a little mini-game with you riding them. Either you'd race another person around an aquatic-themed track, or you'd do some other mini-game like jumping through hoops or whatever, and if you complete the trial well enough, your Pokemon would receive a license for aquatic transport. Where would it go? Well, every Pokemon summary section has a page for marks and ribbons, and this would fit perfectly there. Once the trial is completed, then your Pokemon gets a harness custom made for them, and they can now be available to use for aquatic transport. And this idea applies to all of the field moves. They would have some main location where the player can visit to apply for a license. Think of situations like Miss Dralton City and Forestry City giving the aerial transport license, or Pewter City and Oreburgh City giving the license for boulder smashing. In the PC would be a separate box where there is one slot per field move in the game. This is the field move box. When selecting a Pokemon in the PC, there would be an additional option, Register. Selecting that option would ask if you wanted to register that team member as your designated ride Pokemon for that specific field move, and if you select yes, and the Pokemon has the correct license for that field move, you would now be able to use it as your mount for that specific field move. A translucent shadow of your Pokemon would appear in the field move box, showing which one you're using for that specific type of mount. You can only have one Pokemon assigned to a field move, but you can switch them out at will, provided that your Pokemon have the correct license. To prevent soft locks, you are unable to release Pokemon that are currently registered as ride mounts. From then on, riding Pokemon would behave exactly like Legends Arceus, where you can smoothly transition between your available mounts, and you can dismount them at will. I think this system solves many of the problems of the other two systems. It doesn't restrict team composition because you can give a license to a Pokemon in your PC, but you could also give it to one of your team members and register that one instead. In addition, the Pokemon that are capable of earning a license are not restricted to which Pokemon can learn the equivalent HM move. For example, Metagross should theoretically be able to carry people for aerial transport, and Doduo shouldn't. But Doduo can learn Fly, and Metagross cannot. This new system would allow Metagross to carry us in the air while stopping Doduo from doing so. What happens when your player encounters a wild Pokemon while surfing and sends out the Pokemon they're using to surf? Well, we can just have the player stand on that immersion-breaking floating platform. For land transport, the player can get off the mount temporarily. This system also allows a player to grow closer with the Pokemon they own, seeing as they are riding Pokemon that they themselves have obtained. In addition, this doesn't restrict the primary purpose of field moves, that being gaining progression. Players won't be able to register for those specific field moves unless they reach a certain city or town, or unless they hit a certain story point. It can even be tied to gym badges, where only once they beat a certain gym leader will they be able to register their Pokemon at the registration building in the city or town the gym is at. It can even be tied to defeating certain parts of the evil team's story. Just have the members of the evil team take over one of these registration buildings, and the player can only do the trial once the building has been freed, either by putting the boss directly in the building, or having the player go to the evil team's hideout nearby, and only once they clear that out will the evil team admin give the order for the grunts to evacuate the registration building. I think this idea is so versatile. It can be manipulated to serve whatever purpose the devs want it to serve, all while still serving the original primary function of gaining progression and the secondary function of giving the players Pokemon uses outside of battle. In a fully realized scenario, there might even be more to the system, such as paying for the license, but maybe have the first one be free. It could also be a rental system, where if the player does not want to engage with the licensing mechanics, they can just rent out a Pokemon to ride. They'd have to pay to rent a ride Pokemon until the next city, and every city would have a place to rent mounts. Only specific cities would allow for the licensing of your captured Pokemon, however. In addition to all of the other benefits, I feel this system also increases immersion and the in-world realism. With recent games, the only things we can do with our own Pokemon, with the exception of Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, contests in Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl, and the Koraidon or Miraidon in Scarlet and Violet, our Pokemon only exist for battle. And that's a problem. In a world where humans' lives are intertwined with Pokemon, we really don't get to do much with them outside of battling. As I mentioned before, the anime and Detective Pikachu movie do a great job at showing this, but the games don't. This would be one way that a trained Pokemon aids humans in situations outside of combat. Another huge positive for this implementation of field moves is player choice. It's designed to allow players to interact with it as much or as little as they want. If someone doesn't really care about engaging with this system, they can just keep renting ride Pokemon. Someone who is really interested in this system can register all of their Pokemon for every field move that the game lets them. Most people will fall somewhere in the middle. It also incentivizes people to catch a wider variety of Pokemon so they can have a ride Pokemon available to them for every field move. Some of the Pokemon in the player's party don't have to have their moves restricted either, and if a player doesn't want to, for example, have a Pokemon capable of surfing on their team, they can still use a rental one, or one that's just sitting in their PC boxes. The only real downsides that I can see are that it wouldn't really do much to help the lackluster route design, and it wouldn't have the smoothness of switching between different types of terrain that Koraidon and Miraidon enable. As for the route design, I feel that they can be spiced up in other ways, which I might go over in a future episode. When it comes to the smoothness of Koraidon and Miraidon, I think going a step back to something less smooth, but still pretty smooth, like in Legends Arceus, is the sacrifice I'd be willing to make. Unfortunately, this will probably never come to the mainline games, because for each ride Pokemon, the developers would have to create assets for each Pokemon that is capable of being ridden. They would need some sort of harness or saddle and riding animations as well. This is too much work for a franchise that releases it annually. If one of the development teams at Game Freak took 5 or more years to make a game, maybe they could do this, but that's not going to happen. Well, if the system I proposed before most likely won't be coming to the mainline games, at least in the way I imagine it, these next few ideas definitely won't, because they depend on that system being implemented and require additional work on top of that. But that doesn't mean I can't daydream about what such a feature could bring to the table. First off, customization. This is kind of a short one, but if you could customize the harness used to ride the Pokemon, then that could lead to even more player expression. Not only can players choose how to dress themselves, they can also do so for the Pokemon they would end up riding. Next, minigames. I feel that a way to improve upon Cut and Rock Smash is to tie it to a minigame. There should be a way to opt out of Cut and Rock Smash minigames so it doesn't drag the game on. If opted out, it functions exactly like it did in Generations 1 through 6, with no or little to no reward other than the obstacle being removed from the map until the map gets reloaded. But if opted in, it could be a good method to get certain items, like held items, evolutionary stones, or berries. Of course, this would be an RNG system, where you could raise your odds of getting a particular item by performing better at the minigame, or using a Pokemon that's trained more in the use of that specific field move. There should also be different loot tables depending on where the obstacle is located. For example, breaking a rock in an icy cave would have a higher chance of yielding a never melt ice, or an ice stone, compared to breaking a rock in a volcano. The minigame specifically could go down different routes. One could be a rhythm game where you have to find the right frequency to press a button for your Pokemon to find rewards. Punch the rock too frequently and you'll smash the rewards. Punch it infrequently enough and, I don't know, other Pokemon steal the items. Or maybe your Pokemon gets impatient and smashes the rewards anyway. I don't know. It could also just be a repeat of the Grand Underground minigame from Diamond Pearl Platinum and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Or it could be similar to Cooking Curry in Sword and Shield, where you have to do multiple tasks like pounding the rock, brushing away parts that crumble, and scooping out the treasures. The same could be applied to the Cut minigame, but it would probably yield more natural rewards like leftovers, Farfetch'd Leek, or berries. As your Pokemon performs the field moves more, they become better at it, raising the odds of finding rarer items. It can also be determined by Pokemon species, but that shouldn't be the only limiting factor. You should also be able to pay an expert to train your Pokemon in that specific skill, but only up to a certain point. Another option for rewards is collectibles, like the room decorations in Monster Hunter Rise. When performing Cut, your Pokemon has the option to whittle and carve the wood into a small statue that you can either collect as a collector or sell for money. The same can be done for Rock Smash, but with rocks and gemstone statues. I think this could be a neat idea. Anyway, moving on from Rock Smash and Cut to Surf and Fly, the licensing system enables new ways to explore both the air and the sea. it would make sense that each ride Pokemon would have different stats. Riding something fast, like Talonflame, should probably feel different than riding something slow, like Tropius. That's where the new air and water obstacles come in. I'm talking about vortexes and heavy winds in the air, and torrents and waves for the water, and whirlpools too, I guess. Flying in high altitudes results in more chaotic airflows, meaning that you'll need a Pokemon that has more control over its flight like Skarmory, something that won't be easily thrown off course by the gusts blowing around. Other parts of the map might contain high wind speeds. These can be combated by riding a fast Pokemon. They can outpace the fast gusts and get to the other side. In the water, there can be whirlpools that require maneuverability from Pokemon like Lapras, and fast-moving water that require quicker Pokemon like Sharpedo. Why might a player want to traverse these obstacles? Because there's loot, either hidden beyond the obstacles or in the areas with them. Scarlet and Violet introduced Pokemon-specific drops, so maybe some Pokemon just naturally shed their parts, like scales or feathers. Pokemon parts that come from rarer Pokemon should naturally be harder to find and reside in tough-to-reach areas. Maybe some legendary Pokemon reside in those hard-to-reach areas too. The thing is, these two ideas, the Cut and Rock Smash idea and the Surf and Fly idea, can lead to a whole new group of NPCs. Collectors of rare items. They might pay a pretty penny for a rare Pokemon scale picked up while surfing, or a well-carved gemstone obtained from smashing a rock. There can even be whole new side quests dedicated to finding these collector's items, and the rewards can be, well, anything. Obviously, the most prestigious of collectors would be quite wealthy, so they can have resources and connections that benefit the player. My last idea that the system can bring about is competition. Similar to the Pokeathlon, one competition could just be like a straight-up race across land, or across the water, or in the air. To avoid purely fast Pokemon winning every competition, there might be sharp turns or obstacles that require high maneuverability to avoid. Another option could be like Pokemon Legends Arceus' Drifloon Balloon minigames, and another option could be similar to the Pokemon contests, where the goal is to have some sort of routine in the air or a sea that dazzles an audience, almost like a choreographed dance routine. Different Pokemon can do different tricks to different degrees of difficulty, and the player can train their Pokemon to get better at certain tricks. Perform the tricks well enough in a row, and with good timing, and you'll score well. HMs and field moves are so ripe with potential. It seems Game Freak has only scratched the surface of what they can be, but with every game that passes, they move further and further away from that potential in the name of improving the quality of life for players. However, I don't think they know that the two are not mutually exclusive: quality of life and a more in-depth field move system. Either they don't know, or they physically aren't able to do these things. What I really don't hope is that they are aware of what the system could be, and are willingly choose not to do it because they don't want to. Not being able to because of scope, or time, or whatever, is a far better reason than just not wanting to. Of course, having a more in-depth system like the one I proposed and daydreamt about would potentially take some of the focus away from battling, but I think that given enough time and effort, Pokemon games can prioritize other avenues of interaction with Pokemon as much as they do with their battling system. I can only hope that you all can see that field moves can be so much more, even if you might disagree with what I have proposed. Speaking of which, if what I have said has caused some gears to turn in your brain, if I've given you any ideas, be sure to leave a comment down below. If you have alternative solutions, or don't think that what I have said is as good as I claim it to be, also leave a comment down below. I'm interested to hear what you have to say. I should probably wrap up here. Be sure to head on over to my second channel if you want to stay updated with what I'm playing, link in the description below, and subscribe here if you want to be notified when I upload my next episode. Speaking of which, you all have voted, and the next episode will be about evil teams. But before that, I'm probably going to make a video about my thoughts on Pokemon Violet, since I've now completed the game. See you over on my second channel, Or if you don't visit, I'll see you here when the next video comes out.